What's being talked about right now with the International Accounting Standards Board and the FASB really is just trying to come across some common standards for operating leases. Today, different tenants and different companies can treat operating leases in very different manners. And they think for the benefit of investors, it makes sense to end up with one common standard. And so that's what they're trying to do, is just greater transparency and one common standard for all operating leases. The first thing is they're not going to have rent expense anymore, so that'll be a big change for tenants coming up. Instead, what the tenant's going to have is they're going to have an asset and a liability on their financial statements. The asset basically is going to be called a right-to-use asset. You have the right to use that piece of equipment. You have the right to operate in that leased space. You're also going to have a liability, and that liability really is to pay rent. You owe whoever you're leasing, the lessor, the monies for that lease. And so that's what you're going to have. You're going to have an asset and a liability. The other thing that tenants need to be aware of is what it might mean to their EBITDA and their financial covenants. So they need to look at what it means to their investors and bankers who look at EBITDA, and then also their bankers who look at things like their debt coverage ratio and their interest coverage ratio. Right now, they're going to end up with more debt on their books that they didn't have before. So their debt coverage ratio will go up. They're now going to have more interest expense on their financial statements, so their interest coverage ratio will go down. So there's going to be several different effects to tenants as a result of this new standard that's being proposed. Right now, the timing of that is a little unclear. This first standard really deals with the lessee side, but what the lessor, there will be a change. The timing of it is just not clear right now. I think there's two proposals that are being kicked about right now, and I think the thing that makes the most sense really is to mirror what is happening to the tenant, but just the reverse of it. And so what's going to happen is the landlord will have an asset. It's going to be a receivable of rents from that tenant, or a receivable of those lease obligations from that tenant. They're also going to have a liability like the tenant does. In this case, it's an obligation to perform services for the tenant. You have to provide that leased equipment, or you have to provide that leased space. So that's what you're going to see for the landlords. I think the other thing the landlords need to be aware of is this decision going to cause any different behavior on behalf of the tenants? Are you going to want to sign a shorter lease term? And the reason I say that is because right now, today as a tenant, you don't have the lease on your books. You just disclose it in your financial statements. Well, now with this new lease standard, you will have an asset and a liability, as I talked about. And so I think what's going to be interesting is, are you going to try and minimize that asset and liability by signing a shorter term lease? So it'll be interesting to see if that's the case. And some people have talked about, since I'm going to have to put the asset and liability in my books anyway, should I just go ahead and buy the property? That's a whole other interesting topic, and it'll be interesting to see whether both that from the landlord's perspective and the tenant's perspective, to see if any of that plays out as a result of this treatment.